Today we are looking at mindset, learning and unlearning. So the following slides are going to give you an introduction into these concepts, and then they'll be discussed in more detail in class. Now you'll have to forgive me for using my second Star Wars quote of the semester, and I really honestly am not a big fan of Star Wars. It's fine, but these quotes seem to keep coming my way and I'm using them. So Obi-Wan Kenobi said, "You must learn the ways of the Force," to Luke Skywalker. And the approach to learning that we see in Star Wars is the kind of learning that we should all aspire to, and the sort of learning that leads to really positive outcomes for individuals and for teams. Now, before we get on to looking at some of the details about the kind of learning that we do, I want to introduce you to the work of Carol Dweck. You can see the quote here. She says, "Change can be tough, but I've never heard anybody say it wasn't worth it." And we're going to discuss the contribution that Carol Dweck has made to our understanding of learning, and that will form a foundation for this class and also should inform some of the thinking that you use in the forthcoming class on talent. So we're going to talk a little bit about attitude and mindset. Now, especially in even our university environment, there's a lot of responsibility on the part of students for their own learning. And that doesn't mean that their lecturers get to be lazy, but actually some of the most valuable skills we develop at university relate to organization, self-discipline, critical thinking, and self-reflection. They're some of the core employability skills that you are gathering as you go through your university degrees. Now, these are not things that develop as a result of what you're being told in a lecture by academics, but actually you've cultivated these skills yourself. Although in this actual lecture I am talking about some of these things, but we'll bypass the irony there. So some of the challenges we face as learners are actually posed by our own attitudes and beliefs about learning. We might not even be fully aware of our own beliefs towards learning when we're actually involved in the process of doing learning. The interesting thing is that depending on your mindset, the chances of you being interested in, for example, the feedback you get from lecturers and motivated to do anything about it when you get it might be very different. That's just one example of the way in which mindset affects learning. So Carol Dweck is a professor of psychology at Stanford University, and she's dedicated her career to exploring learning. And she's found that your beliefs and attitudes towards learning can significantly shape the potential you have to learn in the first place. One of Dweck's most celebrated contributions to research in this area looks at the differences between what she calls fixed mindsets and growth mindsets. She conducted a number of experiments in classroom environments looking at different students' responses to challenges and performance feedback. People with fixed mindsets think that their intelligence and ability are static and fixed and cannot be changed. That means that they believe that intelligence is something inherent that you're born with, and any success you experience is simply confirmation of that inbuilt intelligence. People with fixed mindsets therefore consider episodes of failure as evidence that discredits their intelligence, which they find difficult to deal with because their beliefs do not suggest to them that there is anything that can be done to change their situation. Now, Dweck says that people with fixed mindsets tend to avoid challenge and potential failure at all costs. They're uncomfortable with being tested to their limits because they believe they can't do anything to change those limits. On the other hand, people with growth mindsets relish challenges. They recognize the relationship between failure and learning, and therefore they don't think that an episode of failure discredits their intelligence. Rather, they believe it's the most effective way of understanding what they need to do in order to improve. Now, words often associated with fixed mindsets are words such as bright, smart, gifted, talented, natural. And words associated with growth mindsets are words like hardworking, effort, perseverance, and resilience. In a famous experiment, Dweck split a class in half after they had completed a test. And she delivered feedback to one half of the class, praising their intelligence and their talents, reinforcing the fixed mindset. The other half of the class received feedback praising the amount of effort they had clearly put into the work and encouraged them to keep persevering with that effort, reinforcing the growth mindset. Now then, Dweck played a sort of trick on the class for the experiment. In the next test the students took, all of them were deliberately given lower marks. Basically, they were given bad marks on purpose. And the feedback followed the same approach. The first half of students, the fixed mindset group, was given feedback that was essentially communicating that this test was clearly too hard for them and simply beyond their abilities. The second half of the class, the growth mindset group, they were encouraged to keep working hard and they would get there eventually. Now then, Dweck set a third class test. What do you think happened? Well, a significant proportion of the students who had been told that they were naturally smart and their poor performance in the second test clearly demonstrated they just weren't smart enough. A significant proportion of that group tried to cheat in the third test. And the ones who didn't actually cheat, they just gave up. They finished halfway through because they felt that they weren't going to do well. So what was the point in trying? Now the other half of the experiment group, the growth mindset group, they had applied this reinforcement of effort into the third test, and they actually performed better than they had before, and they performed the best out of all the points in the experiment. So what had Dweck discovered through this? She had found that those who have a mindset and attitude towards learning that is fixed look for the easy tasks because doing well in easy tasks serves to affirm their apparently God-given intelligence. If they are challenged or encounter failure, they look to avoid, cheat, or find a way of discrediting the source of the challenge in order to preserve their sense of smartness. Whereas growth mindset people actively look for challenges. They relish the opportunity to test themselves and they engage with feedback in a positive and proactive way. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that those who fall into the growth mindset category also ultimately achieve more than their fixed mindset peers. Now, this relates generally to failure and our own attitude towards failure. We talked previously about failure a little bit in the class, and you've seen in the experiments that Carol Dweck carried out that students who adopted a fixed mindset, or generally people who adopt a fixed mindset, when they encounter a challenge that brings into question the limits of their ability, people tend to respond to failure negatively and just give up. And there's a common trait amongst people with fixed mindsets, which is they never try their hardest, because when you try your hardest, you demonstrate to yourself your limits. And if you believe that your limits are unmovable, then that's a very uncomfortable thing to try and deal with when you think that as soon as you found how well you can perform in a test through doing your absolute hardest, trying your absolute hardest, as soon as you find out that limit, you've discovered a brick wall. So very often people with fixed mindsets deliberately underachieve or deliberately underperform or deliberately withdraw effort because they really don't want to find out about that limitation. Unfortunately, there is a proven link between failure and learning. So people with growth mindsets do achieve more because they're comfortable with discovering their limitations, and when they do encounter their limits, they are then able to understand what it is they need to do to improve and extend those limits, because you can't understand what's required to improve until you've actually encountered your threshold of ability. And I'm sure everybody has heard of Michael Jordan, probably the most famous basketball player who's ever lived and one of the most successful. And even he, the apparently God-given talent of American basketball, discusses failure when he's referring to his success. He said in a famous quote, "I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and I've missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." This is a slide I've shown before in the first lecture for this class, and it compares the attitude of an industry and teams operating within one industry, that being aviation, and the attitude of teams operating in healthcare. And one of the things that has been established as characteristics between the two industries is that aviation over the years, and really since the 1970s, has adopted a growth mindset. It has adopted an attitude towards accidents, failures, and disasters that means they are set up to learn, properly learn, and are positioned to actually go through significant shifts in behavior every time an error occurs. And the reason that it's important to share the difference between these two industries is because it boils down to the teams and the individuals that operate within these industries who are driving that behavior as a kind of organizational environmental culture. And it relates back to Dweck's ideas of fixed and growth mindset, as I've said. So in aviation, what happens when someone makes a mistake, when someone notices something that isn't quite right, there is a universal system of logging these incidents that is shared among pilots across the world. And the important thing that distinguishes aviation from an environment like healthcare is that there is no culture of blame and there's no system of blame when someone does something wrong. So when a pilot makes an error, there is no mechanism to punish him for the error, as him or her, I should very rightly point out. There is no mechanism for them to be punished for their error, only a mechanism for them to log it for the benefit of other pilots. And that contrasts quite sharply with the world of particularly surgery, but generally healthcare and medicine, where unfortunately the ego of the doctor is still very much bound up within the organizational practices. So when a doctor explains that the result of surgery is that someone has died, and their explanation for it is simply, well, these things happen sometimes. That's a common phrase that's been established to be used in the medical profession to explain why something might have gone wrong. And the reason that's useful for us to look at is because that is actually it's a demonstration of a fixed mindset, because the doctor is not able to decouple their personal involvement and their professional identity from the events that took place. And the way they're choosing to explain it is to externalize any responsibility for what took place. So rather than a surgeon, for example, after an operation has gone wrong, saying, "We did our best, we were organized, we went through the procedure that we know that works, but unfortunately, the result of that procedure is that the patient didn't survive, and we are going to look in to see if the system that we use in any way contributed directly to the death of the patient, and if so, that will allow us to learn from it and improve it for the future. That would be from a learning point of view, that would be a very good way of approaching the process. Unfortunately, traditionally in healthcare, what happens is that explanation is doctors find it difficult to share that kind of an explanation with the loved ones of patients, because it seems to suggest that there was the chance that they may have survived in different circumstances, rather than externalizing it to say, well, these things just sometimes happen. The problem is that when the doctors then internalize that explanation, saying basically they were as good as they could be, they're just a skilled pair of hands going through the process, and it was the human body that let everybody down, and that's why the patient died. That doctor is not putting themselves in a position to learn from the fatal conclusion of surgery, and therefore they are not adopting a growth mindset, and they are actually at a grander scale, they are probably directly contributing to the future deaths of other patients, because there has been no willingness to consider how their involvement in the process may have contributed to fatal circumstances for the patient. And they tie a lot of that up with the ego of the doctor, the nature of being an expert, the nature of going through a challenging process to eventually arrive at the status of being a doctor. And there is this sort of omniscient, omnipotent kind of aura that is related to doctors traditionally. That's starting to be targeted and addressed in the healthcare profession, because it is being recognized that that kind of mindset actually leads to death. And they're looking to other industries like aviation, where the number of accidents has been reduced and reduced and reduced year on year as a result of this open culture of sharing and a culture of learning from errors. And that led to a landmark year in the last decade. In 2017, there were no fatal accidents in commercial aviation. It's the first time ever that that's happened. And they attribute in large part that statistic to the sort of culture of learning that has been fostered within aviation over recent years.